Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Jeroen Eijsink, who is president of C.H. Robinson Europe. And today we're going to talk about transportation procurement, understanding the similarities and differences in the U.S. and EU markets. Now, many companies, especially those that have grown through mergers and acquisitions, have transportation operations around the world, including in the U.S. and the EU. And although trying to take a holistic and standardized approach to transportation management would help with visibility and control, the fact is that the operating realities in each market is different. So for transportation professionals, it's very important to really understand what those both the similarities and the differences are, so that they can craft an effective and appropriate strategy and plan moving forward. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about some of those similarities and differences as it relates to the European Union and the U.S. markets. And it's great to have Jeroen here, who's on the front lines of this. They're based in Europe to kind of share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Jeroen, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a topic close to my heart, representing an American company as a European in Europe.
Great. So, we've had, many of your colleagues from C.H. Robinson on Talking Logistics before, but this is your first time. And so I always, when I bring someone new onto the program, before we kind of dive into the topic, I always like to just get a little bit of background in terms of how and why they got involved with supply chain logistics to begin with, and, what your current role and responsibilities are there at C.H. Robinson. So why don't we start there? Just briefly tell us a little bit about your career path and what you do there at C.H. Robinson, and then we'll dive into the topic.
My pleasure. So I joined C.H. Robinson about 2 years ago. I'm here responsible for all our European activities that goes across overland transportation as well as air and sea forwarding, as we have here in Europe as well. I joined C.H. Robinson coming from DHL, where I was responsible for overland operations in various countries, being Ireland, UK, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany. So in that sense, I have a very broad picture of the European market, coming from a global company in that sense. And prior to that, I was on the customer side with a large engineering manufacturing company called Siemens, probably well known in the US as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So great, experience both on the shipper side, if you will, and then obviously a great experience and broad experience there in the European market. So let's go right into the topic now. Like I said in my opening comments, I mean, when it comes to the truckload, market and procuring truckload services, I mean, there are a lot of differences and similarities between the U.S. and EU. So let's focus on some of the, critical factors, important factors that truckload procurement professionals really need to take into consideration, starting with the carrier market itself. I mean, how does the carrier demographics in the EU compare to that in the U.S.? What are some of the key differences?
So first of all, I think that if you look at it from a macro point of view, there are very much many similarities. Above all, it's also a very fragmented carrier market in Europe. Also, most of the carriers that we work with and do the bulk of the freight have a low number of vehicles, maybe 4 to 10. So it is sad statistically that over 90% of the carriers in Europe have less than 50 trucks for sure. So that is not dissimilar to the US. So in that sense, you would expect similar market behavior. I think there's a couple of things that are distinct. I think, first of all, Europe is not the United States of Europe. Although we have the EU, Europe is still a set of sovereign states, and which is continuously enlarged. And that provides us with an opportunity on the carrier side, that we continue to have fresh supply of carriers coming out of the new territories of the European Union. So obviously in recent history, we had a large carrier pool coming from Poland. After that, obviously Bulgaria, Romania, and nowadays we're obviously discussing opportunities going as far as, for example, the Ukraine. So that is an opportunity on one hand, that due to this enlargement, we continue to have a broader carrier base. That's maybe dissimilar to the US, where now that the economy is going reasonably well, you can see that there is more constraint on capacity in the short term.
Yeah, no, but very interesting. I mean, and you're right. I mean, I think obviously here in the United States, it's well known that the vast majority, you have a lot of owner operators, and the vast majority of carriers are, folks with one truck or two trucks, right? So I think that sounds like it's similar to the U.S. Now, in terms of kind of that small, the way the small carriers work with, shippers or with 3PLs, any differences there? In terms of the relationship between, do shippers tend to work, or do these small carriers tend to work directly with shippers, or is there still a lot of, working with brokers or working with large 3PLs there?
So I think traditionally Europe doesn't have a brokerage culture, and C.H. Robinson is particularly unique in that market, and I can comment on that a little bit later about what that means in terms of how we see the market moving forward. But traditionally, we work very much with asset-heavy operators that are connected to shippers through forwarders, normally on a longer-term contract basis. So both the shippers tend to prefer longer-term contracts that secure capacity and rates for a period of 12 months' time, typically, whilst at the same token, the forwarders try to secure a back-to-back contract with asset-heavy carriers, multiple of those, given the fragmented market. But that is what dating rates and to minimize the risk on availability of capacity. And that has been the prevailing model in Europe from an historic point of view. I think that model is changing now because fluctuations in demand and supply are putting that model of 12 months back-to-back guarantees under pressure. If you, for example, think about the Christmas boom fueled by some of these large e-commerce providers, you will find that they have to do mini tenders for Q4 simply to deal with these large fluctuations. And that obviously changes the dynamics. The second piece that is changing the world is that technology providers like Uber, albeit not in freight in Europe, they basically show us that an asset-free brokerage model is not something bad. It's actually that can be something very convenient, and that opens the door to typical brokerage platforms like we are to enter the market successfully. So I think that in that sense, the market behavior is changing and moving towards a more flexible mode. I would say on the shipping side, the preference still is longer-term committed rates. You will not find a lot of risk-friendly buying behavior. Be it on the carrier side, I think the brokerage behavior is much more prevalent. So people are much more risk open on the buy side. Obviously, the market was soft. We got a supply of new carriers coming in. When the market is tipping, you typically see that behavior bouncing back, of course. But that is where we are. So we are dependent on the market fluctuations day by day. But strategically, I think the market is getting a little bit more flexible. Although I do not expect the European market to have similar dynamics as the North American brokerage-dominated market in the long run. I think they will meet each other in the middle. I see in the North American market, at least I understand from my colleagues, that securing capacity for a longer term and securing rates for a longer term is a procurement model that you see more and more often there as well.
Right. Yeah, no, very interesting. Now, I've had the chance to go to Europe a few times, and I can't help but notice that, kind of the trucks look a little bit different there than they do here in the U.S. So, are the types of trucks and trailers and the pallets and the kind of other conveyances that are used in the two markets different? And what impact does that have, from a transportation procurement or professional standpoint?
So they are definitely different. And I always see our customers here in Europe smile when we come with C.H. Robinson slides with this Peterbilt on at the front of it. They all love the truck as a kind of an interesting picture, but no, you won't find those. But that is not necessarily relevant. I think a couple of relevant things are that certainly our trucks are normally shorter, less wide, and less high. It's minimal. But the capacity that a truck in Europe can carry, that is normally 13.6 meters long, 2.45 meters wide, and about 2.5 meters high, is sort of in all of its dimensions a few inches smaller than a U.S. truck, and therefore carries less capacity. Our pallets that we normally use are smaller. The typical European pallet is 120 times 80 centimeters. That is, you have to do your work and do it in inches if you if you wouldn't mind. And whilst the US pallet is normally a little bit wider with 120 times 100, and that obviously means that the capacity the trucks can carry is slightly different. What is also interesting fact is that if you look at the number of trailers per truck, in the US we think statistically it's almost close to 3 trailers per truck statistically on average, whilst in Europe it's well below 2. It's more like 1.5 or 1.4 trailers per truck. So that means that our carriers normally like to take their trailer back home, and trailer swapping is not something that is traditionally a big thing here in Europe. Again, this is not black and white. That number is probably rising in Europe because the demand of flexible capacity is increasing, but it is different. So if you come with procurement strategies that are based on trailer swapping, stand trailers, you will find it more challenging to get a very competitive rate here than you might have in Europe, for example. And obviously, you have to look at your metrics to see if you calculate your transportation cost per cubic meter, or you calculate it per kilo. You just got to realize that the dimensions that we can carry in a truck are different, and therefore you cannot compare the metrics like for like. And on the joke that I started with the Peterbilt truck versus the Mercedes truck, it's obvious that our fuel costs in Europe are highly driven by taxation, and traditionally have been higher if you compare it on a per liter basis in Europe. So fuel efficient driving, fuel efficient trucks, and fuel efficiency have probably played a more dominating role traditionally in the development of trucks in Europe than might have been in the US. Again, that is changing, I think, on both sides. The drive for more efficient is increasing, but therefore you will find a different type of trucks in the way that they are built, the type of engines that we traditionally have in. So those are the differences, and that for the user, the shipper, that basically means that you got to consider that our fuel costs play a dominant role in the rates, and therefore comparing rates like for like is going to be challenging.
Right. I want to get to fuel costs in just a minute here, and I think it's interesting the ratio between tractors and trailers, kind of the differences there. Certainly here in the U.S., drop shipping is a very popular strategy. As a way to keep the power units moving, as a way to make some of the operations more efficient, particularly on the warehousing side and things like that. But I didn't realize there was such a big difference between that ratio between here in the U.S. and there in Europe. I think another thing, you kind of touched upon a little bit earlier in some of your comments in terms of the larger, driver pool, if you will, as it relates to, a factor that I think a lot of folks overlook, and that is cabotage. First of all, for folks that might not be familiar with that, what is, cabotage, and, how does it, differ between, the U.S. and EU, and why is it important?
So basically, the fact is that as we are not the United States of Europe, but we have a set of sovereign states, and you can define Europe the way you want. You can take 15 countries up to 27 from a legal point of view, so to speak. These have different rules, and to protect their workforce, they introduced cabotage rules, which means that foreign carriers are restricted to move goods within the borders of one country to up to 3 loads a week. So they can do a maximum of 3 loads, collecting and delivering within the same country. Now, within the US, you don't have these rules within the United States. You have some rules between US and Canada, and some rules between US and Mexico. So a US truck can deliver or pick up in Canada, but cannot do easily a shipment within Canada. But we have that within a geography with 27 countries. So that limits the opportunities of what we call domestic freight, or freight within borders, to use external trucking. Now, obviously, with the influx of Eastern European carriers and truckers, and therefore the price changes, there are a lot of local Western European companies that have sort of gone out of business, and therefore reducing the capacity within borders, whilst cabotage still restricts companies to come in. So there is that challenge where we as an industry believe that these cabotage rules need to be loosened. And if the European Union believes in one market, they should allow free markets in that sense as well. But that is a lobby that will take some time before we go at it. Now, cabotage, in the sense of using international trucks and use them on those maximum 3 loads a week within a country, is still a relatively small portion of the total freight moved in Europe. If you take the entire freight moved, it's probably certainly less than 5%, maybe even less than 2% of the freight. So cabotage is still very small because of the restrictions that you have around the 3 loads a week. And we believe that needs to be loosened to create a common market. But that will take some time before we get there, because all the member states need to allow that.
Right. No, that's very interesting. I mean, here in the States, I know that, as part of NAFTA, and particularly with Mexican drivers, there was a provision there to allow Mexican drivers to, haul freight into the United States. But there's historically been a lot of resistance to that. It's really still not happening yet. So, there's always the political side of things, the labor side of things that come into that. But certainly a different dynamic there in Europe than in the U.S. So let's go back to fuel now. I mean, you brought it up earlier, and certainly it's one of those top of mind cost factors that transportation professionals have to take into consideration. I mean, here in the U.S., you have fuel surcharge schedules that the shippers and carriers use as a way to as part of their agreements, as a way to manage the fluctuations in fuel costs. I mean, is there a similar process there in the EU?
Yeah, most definitely. I think when I sort of switched from the customer to the carrier side, that was the time when the fuel price starts to fluctuate heavily, and we obviously had to introduce those fuel surcharge mechanisms, and they're now common acceptance within customer contracts. So normally you would look at an indicator that would adjust the fuel price monthly. You have occasionally contracts where customers prefer quarterly, but I cannot think of contracts where there's no proper fuel surcharge mechanism outside of the normal rating in there, and that's been common practice. The challenge, though, is what indicator to use, because we've got so many sovereign member states with different taxation. The fuel price differs country by country, so there is a kind of there are indicators that take a kind of a European average, but obviously depending on where you pull the fuel, you can basically leverage an advantage. So the tendency is that the further you go east, the lower the fuel price. That is sort of the tendency that there is, but that is a different factor. But there are indices that are used and commonly used to manage that. So I think it's just making yourself familiar with these normal mechanisms, and you will find them in the end pretty similar to what you'll find in North America.
Right. And so the other topic is that gets a lot of discussion here is driver shortage, right? And the driver market, and as well as the impact of regulations on driver productivity here in the U.S. with hours of service and the electronic logging devices and things like that. I assume that similar kind of challenges exist in the EU when it comes to the driver pool availability and the impact of regulations?
Oh, absolutely. So I think being a truck driver is not considered a very desirable job, particularly in Western Europe, for all of the restrictions that you have. Obviously, the old romantics of getting in a truck and driving through the countryside is taken away by GPS controls and all of that kind of matters. So it is difficult to find young people to go into trucks. We have abolished in many countries mandatory defense service or army service, as we had, which was a big source of driving talent, because people made their driver's license in the army and then went into the civil economy and became a truck driver. That is obviously supplemented by the EU enlargement, adding a pool of drivers that are coming in. So we have the same challenge, but obviously we still have a reservoir of opportunity coming outside. And I have to make a comment that obviously the discussion and the prediction about autonomy and autonomous vehicles do not help on the labor market, because who wants to enter the labor market in an industry where everybody says in 10 years' time or 20 years' time there won't be any jobs? I think that discussion is obviously important but overrated in a way. It's an opportunity for our industry as well as a threat on the short run. So we have that challenge. But there is a reservoir to deal with. And then we come on the legislative regulatory side, and that is a real bugbear in Europe because we've got so many sovereign member states. So Europe, the European Union, strives for one common market with free movement of goods and people. But at the same token, when it comes to so working hours, driver working hours have been pretty much harmonized across the EU member states. So 4 hours up, then taking a break, then another 4 hours up to maximum, etc. That is pretty much harmonized across most of the member states, and the controls are in place. So in that sense, we have made a lot of progress. But recently, there's a whole debate about minimum wage in Europe, where low-paid jobs, including those of truck drivers, have been subject to minimum wage. And those minimum wage regulations, unfortunately, are made on a sovereign membership member state level. And that is challenging for us because they're obviously different. And the amount of administration and controls in each country are very different. So that means that a Polish truck driver coming from his home base through Germany, delivering a load in France, will be subject to his home rules, in transit through the German rules, and when he ends up in France, to the French rules. And everybody calculates the minimum wage different. And we as forwarders or brokers are liable in case we employ such contract to these rules. So that causes a lot of discussion. And there was when the French law was introduced, there were actually drivers that wanted to avoid to load or unload in France. And that obviously then restricted the driver pool on that market and changed the pricing dynamics. So these are disruptions that we have to work through until that European common market comes. Another example is that many countries are now considering that drivers who are on the road for more than 1 week, which is very common in international traffic, have to spend the weekend outside of their truck. They felt that it was inhuman to have a person spending his weekend in the cabin on a truck stop. Now, funny enough, the drivers were not so bothered about it. They rather stay with their truck and have all their stuff in there than having to go into a cheap hotel somewhere else. But obviously, this is a planning nightmare. So we have drivers that don't want to load on a Friday because they don't want to be stuck in a certain country where this law applies, because they want to be out of that country so that they can stay in their truck in another country. So that is a whole planning nightmare because it's not applied across the whole of Europe. And that obviously restricts movements of goods and therefore artificially reduces the capacity. So in Europe, there is a continuous battle with that, changes in legislation, a continuous lobby to make them at least harmonize across Europe. And I want to emphasize that all these laws are made without the shadow of a doubt for good and to improve the working conditions in which we should have an interest. But we cannot have an interest when they're made by single member states. And that, I have to take, a big applause to our planners who work their way around that all the time, needing to consider all of these kind of things. And that makes Europe particularly special and complicated, and in a way is a justification for the dispatching capability that we as forwarders and brokers have.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, situation there. That's certainly different than what's here. Obviously, like I said, here in the U.S., it's a little bit more. Obviously, it's harmonized because it's just one country, if you will. But I can appreciate kind of that kind of complexity when you're dealing with the different labor laws and minimum wage laws, and trying to keep track of that and making sure that you're in compliance as that shipment is moving across different borders. So very, very interesting.
So just if I make just an additional comment that is also something that is always a bit funny. We Europeans love holidays, right? So we managed to get into our labor contracts more holidays than most of you did in North America. So bless us. But we also have plenty of bank holidays. Unfortunately, they are not harmonized either. So you will find that there's a bank holiday in country XYZ, but unfortunately not in country ABC. And that means you need to plan your way around this. In terms of whether a country can transit through a certain country that happens to have a bank holiday. And unfortunately, Germany has one of the most bank holidays, and it's in the center of Europe. So might cross it easily. So these are all kinds of things that you need to realize when you, that in the end have to be factored into the rates if you want. Because all of these planning restrictions make it more difficult to operate freight exclusively. So those are things, and they're not harmonized, and I don't think it's likely they're going to be harmonized soon. And that sometimes is a bit funny if we talk our performance statistics and have to explain that, there was this national bank holiday in France, and there was this religious bank holiday in Poland, and that's why this and this happened. That is very different than in the US.
Yeah, and it strikes me like right now, I think in many cases, all of that is really reliant on, as you mentioned, kind of on the knowledge of the individual planners or folks that are managing this to know that. I think the opportunity is, and I think you see this in a variety of different ways, is to try to incorporate this as part of the technology, right? Where you're able to take into consideration some of these ancillary factors, right? Whether it's holidays or laws, to try to simplify, if you will, or try to manage this complexity that at the end of the day is what you're talking about here. So that, as your, let's say, a transportation management system is planning things around, it's able to take into consideration the fact that there is a holiday next week or in 2 days' time in such and such country, or that this load is going to be moving across these 3 different, EU countries, and these rates, depending on where he's going to fuel or the labor aspect of it. I mean, do you see that? Do you see an area there with technology helping to manage that complexity a little bit better?
Most definitely. I mean, I among others, in my studies of economics, I did linear programming, and it's just one big formula that you basically need to utilize until reality kicks in, and then just adds variables that you didn't foresee. So yes, I think as a company, I think one of the strengths of being part of this company that has invested so much in technology and practice technology in North America, we're obviously trying to leverage that strength and increasingly try to build these variables in there. And computing power, the emergence of tools for artificial intelligence and machine learning will help us that way. But again, when reality kicks in, it's still very difficult to have the machine learn to deal with these realities. So truck breaks down, that we were scheduled to load somewhere just before the bank holiday. You cannot dispatch another truck. How are you going to do that? How are you going to handle that? And these are very individual scenarios that over time, for sure, a machine can take over. Like I believe with computing power and technology, a machine can take over a lot. But to be honest, certainly in my the span of my career, and consider myself relatively young with 44, we will still need the intelligence and the agility of our planners to deal with it. What is new in technology is, increasingly new, is that we want them to focus on exceptions like these and not on the rules. So I think technology can help us to dispatch a lot of loads that are subject to a very systematic and very stable flows. And they can do magic and make productivity improvements that are beyond belief. And that's why we're hiring smart people to basically deal with those exceptions and manage that freight around. They can handle more freight, and they can focus much more on the needs of the customer rather than just dealing with the grinding through the operational problems that we have day to day. But that is still a challenge. And I think in Europe, given the challenges that I described earlier upon your question about the differences, that's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. I mean, obviously, as an analyst, I'm a big proponent of technology and always looking forward in terms of the new advancements, whether it's artificial intelligence and machine learning and predictive analytics and things like that. But this is still the role of people and smart folks and people that really understand the business and understand the business processes. I think they still play an integral part, a critical part in making sure that things get from point A to point B in a cost efficient and reliable manner. So absolutely, the role of people I think is going to continue to be, important for many years to come. So as a way to kind of wrap up, I just have a couple of questions here. I mean, so at the end of the day, when it comes to the procurement process itself, are there any differences in the way it's conducted in the EU compared to the US? I mean, is the end result in both cases kind of a routing guide?
No, there are differences. I mentioned obviously the tendency to go to contracted versus spot as one difference. Regarding the routing guides, there is a difference. So Europeans tend to give a lane or a bunch of lanes to one carrier and expect that carrier to adhere to that 100% without giving volume commitments. But the contract basically stipulates that you cannot fail, and most contracts actually stipulate that if you fail, that the customer can contract another carrier at your expense if the price is significantly different. So that is common practice. Whilst in North America, the route guide gives you sort of number 1, 2, 3, and you expect the number 1 to adhere, let's say 90% of the times, and he can roll a load back or roll a load forward or give it back, and then you go to number 2 or number 3. That's not common practice here. Obviously, with fluctuating volumes, with the emergence of spot platforms, etc., that practice is changing slowly. But I think the prevalent contracts you will find that the routing guide is you give a bunch of trade lanes to a carrier that then has 100% responsibility no matter what happens to the volume that is there. And because the market is so fragmented and therefore the lever of the shipper is quite high, you will find that practice to sustain for the foreseeable future. If obviously on the forwarding and brokerage side we see a consolidation of the market and therefore that lever becomes maybe not as powerful as it was in the past, there is a more balance of power. And as I've said, with technology and transparency on the market, maybe we can get better to the reality of the real volume patterns, and that's what we're working on. But that is still a way to go.
So with a carrier being awarded kind of 100% of a particular lane, I mean, if they don't happen to have an asset available, whatever, is there a lot of subcontracting that takes place then for them to try to find another carrier perhaps to take it on their behalf?
Well, in principle, most of the work is being done by forwarders who subcontract everything. But if they basically run out of ideas on who to subcontract to on a particular load, which particularly happens in peak season, that forwarder has to make a trade-off. And the trade-off is, hey, I go to a spot platform which shows me the supply. I post it load on the spot and I hope I get something and I'll take a loss on that load as long as it's moved. Or he goes the hard way of going back to the customer and say, hey, I just cannot cover. And then the customer has to figure out a way to find somebody else to cover it, which is normally a competitor that wants to get his foot in the door into the new customer. So that is the way it normally works. And what you do together with the shipper is you try to predict the shipment profile, the volumes, and you try to make some arrangements of how to deal with these peaks and troughs. And I think the increasing understanding of our shippers is that, hey, this is not a sustainable model, certainly not in certain industries. So if you think about the consumer goods industry, if you think about the high-tech industry where there's high fluctuations in demand, I think this model is pretty difficult to hold through because you either surrender cost or you surrender quality. And I think, therefore, the emergence of players like us or other platforms helps them to sort of supplement their core carrier base to deal with these peaks and troughs. So you effectively get a route guide with a number 2, but the number 2 is then a platform how to deal with that.
Right,
Some industry, you have to be, traditional model is still very effective.
Great. So, Jeroen, as a way to kind of wrap up, I mean, in light of all these, factors and differences that we talked about, if I'm a transportation, executive looking to kind of take a holistic approach to the way I, procure and manage, transportation in the U.S. and EU, what advice or recommendations, would you give me? I mean, are there any common mistakes that I should avoid?
Yeah, I hope that this interview showed that just taking your toolbox and send somebody over to Europe to sort of do the same thing is destined to fail. Huh? So you either will notice in quality or on cost that you're not going to be effective. So you need a team on the ground that understands those principles. The principles are not massively different, but given that we are a very cost-sensitive industry, I think that you need to be aware of those. So I think it is awfully important to recognize that the market is not ticking the same as in North America, and you need that advice and skill through own people on the ground or using a partner that knows that and has that skill and ability to deal with that. The macro principles of a fragmented market and the way you want to serve is not so much different. It's the devil is in the detail, really, and that's what you need to be mindful of.
Absolutely. Well, Jeroen, as I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always manage to scratch the surface on these topics, and there's a lot. You said the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of details when it relates to differences and similarities between the U.S. and EU. But I think we touched upon some of the high level ones and some of the important ones today, at least to get transportation professionals thinking about this and perhaps taking a smarter approach moving forward to how they manage their operations. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Much appreciated. It was fun.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for those that joined us today. If you have a question for Jeroen and you're watching this episode either at the C.H. Robinson website or on Talking Logistics, you can go ahead and post it there, and I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.